Let's do it. Okay, so welcome everyone. Today is our very first Judy Slee student seminar of 2021. And this seminar is named in honour and memory of Dr. Judy Slee, who was a cognitive psychologist who was an RSP for many, many years. She was a highly regarded teacher and a very special mentor to both students, but also ECI academic staff. Today we have an excellent lineup of graduate students, and quite fittingly, we also have two fabulous graduate students running the show today. So first you'll hear from Michaela, and then Michaela will hand over to Neve and Narisha, who are running the show today. Over to you, Michaela.
Hi everyone, thanks for joining the psychology seminar series. Just a few housekeeping rules. Just a reminder that this seminar is being recorded and will be available on the psychology YouTube playlist. Upon entry of the webinar, you'll all be muted, and we ask that you please stay muted for the duration of this seminar. We will have question time at the end of the seminar. If you have any questions, you can write them down in the Q&A box below at any time. Alternatively, if you raise your hand, I will unmute you and you can ask your question. Thank you, and I'll hand off to our theme conveners.
Hi, I'm Narisha, and along with Neve, we are helping put together the graduate research seminar this year. First, we'd just like to start with an acknowledgement of country. So we acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet, and we pay our respect to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past and present. So our first speaker today is Jaimee Forster. Jaimee is a second year clinical PhD student here at the RSP. Her research investigates how beliefs are formed along the delusional continuum and how cognitive and emotional processes interact in delusion formation. So here she is.
Thanks, Narisha. I'll just get my PowerPoint up. All right. Hopefully people can hear and see that. Yep. Okay. So I want you to imagine that you're standing just here on the edge of the Grand Canyon skywalk. If you take a step forward, you'll be able to move onto the skywalk, further into the canyon, able to appreciate the magnificent view. However, you'll also be putting yourself in danger of falling over 200 meters down into the canyon to your death. So in a situation like this one, we can imagine that our physiological and emotional reactions might be quite strong. So our hands may be sweating, heart racing, feeling sick to our stomach, feeling scared and having thoughts like this isn't safe and I'm in danger. But with time, our rational mind may kick in, reminding us of things like the glass is very thick, it was designed by engineers, and hundreds of people walk on this skywalk every day. So you take a breath and step on the skywalk. This balance between our emotional and cognitive inputs is something that we're actually all balancing daily when we're forming beliefs through making lots of decisions. And although it can be really hard to overcome emotional inputs, usually in non-clinical populations, the cognitions can win, letting us make rational choices. However, it's been shown that in people with schizophrenia and delusions, often their emotions win this battle and are too strong for the cognitive component to overcome it. And this is really fundamental to early research in schizophrenia. The founder of the term schizophrenia said, the earliest conceptualizations of schizophrenia emphasize fragmented thinking exhibited by patients and a disconnect between affective and cognitive functions. And this has been reflected in the empirical and neuropsychological literature. So it's been shown consistently that those with schizophrenia have cognitive deficits. So things like lower IQ, working memory ability, and impaired frontal lobe functioning, as well as an increased salience towards emotional material, such as struggling to forget emotional cues and having increased dopamine. It's begun to be looked at head-to-head. So in a series of studies, it was looked at how cognitive capacity can override emotional cues when they're told to forget about emotional cues. And it's been shown that in the face of emotional cues, people with schizophrenia find it really hard to use their cognitive capacity in comparison to healthy individuals. So while we have a lot of evidence for a reduced cognitive capacity and this increased emotional salience, and are beginning to look at what happens when the two are placed head to head, no research has really stripped this all back and found that, for new decisions with no prior beliefs, what happens when we present people with emotional and cognitive inputs along the delusional continuum. And that's what my first study is looking into. And to do this, we're going to be using a novel methodology called discrete-choice conjoint analysis, which is a technique that was originally introduced in marketing and product design. And I feel the best way to explain it is with an example. So if we look at the idea of buying a new car, conjoint analysis will look at that car as simply a bunch of attributes. So these attributes may be its color, its price, and the size of its engine. And you can see on the table here that there's different levels. So blue, black, and red, different prices and different sizes of engine. And what the method does is it asks participants a series of choice questions such as this. So which car would you choose from car 1 and car 2? So you look at the different levels, the different attributes, and you weigh up the different options until you decide which one you would pick. And you do this a number of times. And once you've done this enough times, what happens is that we can get a quantitative estimate of the importance of each attribute in how you made the decision. So what we might find is that color is the most important attribute in deciding which car to buy, and then engine size and price are equal second. So rather than ask about cars, we're going to be presenting participants with this scenario. Imagine a time when space travel is common and humans are inhabiting several other planets beside Earth. You're part of a team of randomly selected community representatives whose job it is to decide whether newly discovered planets are safe for human inhabitation. An advanced team has visited a planet and discovered several new living organisms. Your job is to use their observations and judgments to make decisions about the safety of these organisms. It may often be unclear, given the information provided, which organisms are more safe than others, but it's your job to make the best decision you can, even if you're not certain. To judge the safety of the organisms, you'll now be given a series of choices between 2 organisms at a time. For each organism, some of the advanced team's observations and judgments will be provided. Please read these carefully, as they may be similar to one another. Based on the information provided, choose which organism you believe would be the safest to interact with. So rather than looking at, the color of the car and the price of the car, our attributes are going to be different types of information. And the information is going to fall across two spectrums. One is how rational or emotional the information is, and the other is how safe or threatening it describes the organism to be. So the first rational emotional spectrum comes back to how I started this talk, because there's so much evidence that shows people with schizophrenia rely on emotional information over rational information. And the way that we've written these statements to be different is that the rational statements begin with an observation from a professional about the organism. So the biologist's recent DNA test results show the organism is loyal. Whereas the emotional statements are about a proximal interaction between a person by name and the organism. For example, Timothy's contact with the organism made him feel that it was loyal. The other dimension is how safe or threatening the organism is described to be. And the reason that we've done this is because there's a lot of research that shows people with schizophrenia hold on tightly to more negative than positive information, but we want to disambiguate negative information from threatening information because 80% of delusions are persecutory in nature. And the way that we've written these is that the beginning section is the same. So because these are both rational, they both start with a professional, but the last word is either a safe word or a threatening word. So you can see that across the 2 dimensions, we have 4 different types of statements, which means we have 4 different attributes, and they are rational safe, emotional safe, rational threat, and emotional threat. And each of these statements is going to be provided on 3 levels. So slightly, moderately, or extremely hostile or loyal, which you can see here in an example of what the participants are going to see. So they're going to be presented with 10 choice-like questions such as this, with 4 pieces of information about each organism, and they're going to have to decide which they would rather interact with. And what we're expecting to see is that All participants are going to use more emotional information over rational information, just because that's what has happened in research in the past. However, those higher on the delusional continuum will moderate this effect up, so they'll use emotional and threatening information even more than those lower on the delusional continuum. Our participants are going to be recruited via Prolific, so they're going to be adults from the UK who can speak English, have normal to corrected normal vision, no history of brain damage and no learning disabilities, and we're aiming to get about 300 participants. And as well as the discrete choice task, they're going to be completing demographics and 4 questionnaires. The first, the personality assessment screener, is more about tapping into underlying psychopathology, so looking at things like negative affect and substance use. Then we have the 10-item personality inventory to look at the 5-factor model, specifically interested in neuroticism as it correlates so strongly with other forms of psychopathology. And then finally, the Peters delusion inventory and the community assessment of psychotic experiences to tap into that delusional or psychotic-like expression. So this study is really a study that is going to help bounce us up to be able to answer the question more specifically about how information is used when forming beliefs and delusions. And one of the questions that leads from this study is, does the order in which the information is presented change how beliefs are formed? Because we can imagine if people with a predisposition for delusions are, thrown all this emotional information, maybe then the cognitive capacity can't really overcome it. But what happens when lots of cognitive rational information is presented and then the emotional? So we want to see what happens in different orders. And also the state of the person. So a lot of delusion models talk about stress as a precursor for delusions forming. So we're thinking about some type of stress induction to see if increased stress changes how the information is used. And then finally, hopefully looking at what's happening in the respective brain regions when the decisions are being made. And that's me done. Thank you for listening.
Thank you, Jaimee, for that great presentation. So now, if anyone has any questions for Jaimee to answer, we'll be doing that now.
Jaimee, I can get the ball rolling.
Alrighty, no questions have come through. So,
is your sound on?
Yeah. No questions have come through so far, but I have a question for you. In terms of other kind of psychopathologies like eating disorders, where delusions and beliefs are quite strong, do you think you'll find the same effects with these kind of psychopathologies as you would in schizophrenia?
Good question, and something that I'm interested in and thinking may come up in the study. As you said, lots of other forms of psychopathology have really strong beliefs that may not really be categorized as rational. But I guess the reason we're focusing more on delusions in schizophrenia is because there's this underlying overwhelming evidence that there's this struggle between the two. And there's also lots of models that support that. But I guess by having the personality assessment screener, which can tap into different types of psychopathology, as well as the TIPI, hopefully we can disambiguate other forms of strong beliefs in psychopathology from delusional beliefs.
Great, that sounds really fascinating. Does anyone else have any questions for Jaimee? I guess if there's no more questions, then I'll hand it off to Neve to introduce our next speaker then. But thank you so much, Jaimee.
Thanks, Jaimee, for that wonderful presentation. So next I'll be introducing our second speaker for today, Beth Muir. So Bethany is a second-year PhD candidate at the Research School of Psychology, supervised by Dr. Eryn Newman. She completed a Bachelor of Psychology honours in 2019 at the University of Tasmania. Her PhD research examines how contextual background cues produced through virtual court trials can influence impressions and decisions. Take it away, Bethany.
Thank you, Neve. Let me just share my screen. Okay. Hi everyone, welcome to my presentation. Today I'll be presenting my research on the law on Zoom, contextual cues and the virtual court. And just before I start, I'd like to thank Eryn Newman, Meredith Rosner and David Tate for advising me during this research. So last year there was a dramatic shift to fully remote and virtual courtrooms. But because of this rapid shift, there were no strict guidelines in place about what is and isn't appropriate. As a result, we have seen lawyers appear for virtual court with master beds in the background and even instances of them still appearing in bed. While these are just some examples of the many occasions remote backgrounds have gone wrong, it raises important considerations regarding the professionalism of the courtroom that needs to be addressed in research. So I'll be presenting my research that provides a proof of concept that contextual cues influence character and forensically relevant judgments in the virtual court. And you can follow the progress of the talk at the top of the slide there. So a virtual court is where all trial members congregate in a virtual space like Zoom to conduct trial proceedings. And the photo on the slide here is one of the more common setups that they have at the moment. But before fully remote courtrooms, there was audio-visual link, and this is where one or more members appeared virtually in the physical courtroom. So both of these virtual communications have many benefits, and that is besides social distancing. So there's financial, safety, and equity of access. So those in rural communities have access to the same experts as those in non-rural communities. But there's also limitations. So there's internet, audio, video quality, unplanned interruptions, and there's huge variations in the environment in which members appear. Legal scholars have noted the potential damaging impact of this backdrop that comes with video communication. But to our knowledge, there has been no empirical research in this area. So this, alongside no policy development, demonstrates a gap in knowledge and in the literature that needs to be addressed moving forward. But how can these contextual cues actually lead to bias or influence judgments? So when you think of semantic priming, you can see how particular cues can lead to semantic associations regarding that cue. So the Donald paradigm, for instance, which many of you might know, shows that presenting someone with hostile primes, so if you present them with words like leg, break, arm, this leads them to perceive an ambiguous person more negatively. There are several mechanisms across both social and cognitive psychology that shows how context influences judgments. So there's semantic priming, semantic activation, conceptual fluency. All of these suggest that cues such as context leads to an increased accessibility of similar concepts, which leads to biased judgments. So while there has been quite a bit of research on how primes can influence impressions, there is limited work that has been done within courtrooms and its mechanisms in influencing judgments. So to date, there has been limited application from empirical studies in how primes play out in the courtroom. And this particular study shows that contextual cues leads to not only negative impressions, but high ratings of guilt. So in physical courtrooms, there are sometimes instances where a defendant appears in a dock, as shown in the photo here. Generally, this is the result of the judge making a decision for them to be in the dock, and that implies to jurors that this person might be dangerous. So Rosner and colleagues looked at whether this impacted how the defendant was perceived, and they looked at differences between whether the defendant was seated in a glass dock, an open dock, or at the bar table, presented people with a trial, and saw how their guilt verdicts played out. And they found that on average, participants who viewed the defendant in the dock provided higher guilt ratings than those who saw him at the bar table. Importantly, this difference was found even with the content of the case held constant. So all participants experienced the exact same trial, and the only thing that differed was the placement of the defendant. So this shows that context can drive decisions, at least in a physical courtroom, and particularly contexts that indicate custody. So we might borrow from these studies and conclude that virtual courtroom backgrounds would show a similar pattern,
but there are key differences to highlight between this and our study. So in a physical court, research that looks at things like the dock are relatively salient and blatant, whereas background in a video is much more subtle. So we don't know if people respond to this information in the same way. Other research in the court looks at more diagnostic evidence, such as forensic evidence, rather than subtle cues. So although it may seem like there's a lot of literature to draw upon, this is not the case because we are specifically looking at subtle, non-diagnostic and tangential information. And just to reiterate my point, these 3 screenshots are from 3 very real virtual trials, and you can clearly see the difference between contexts. So I'm interested in whether this first person is evaluated more negatively and maybe even more guilty than this person and this person who appear in home and neutral contexts. So pulling all of these theories and studies together, we can expect this kind of pattern, that custody backgrounds will negatively influence perceptions and related judgments of a person. It is also important to distinguish that a defendant appearing in a custody environment virtually is different to a defendant appearing in a dock. So there are many more reasons, such as not being able to afford bail, for why they're in custody, not just because they're dangerous. So initially, we want to provide a proof of concept that contextual background cues influences judgments. And we do this through 2 studies that look at its impacts on judgments regarding a defendant in both impressions and guilt. But this is just the start of ongoing program of research. So we want to build a solid paradigm that allows us to explore how background cues impact judgments in all areas of a trial. So the next step will look at how this interacts with how people weigh evidence, extending beyond just defendant impressions and looking at how witnesses are perceived. Our studies today also show our method using static photos, but we'll want to be looking at more ecologically valid stimuli such as videos in the future as well. I also want to note that I've been working with the Victoria Court Services in more immersive virtual courtroom trials. So we also look at things like eye contact and Zoom fatigue. But for now, I'll just be sharing these initial findings and providing a proof of concept that contextual background cues influences judgments. So for our first study, we had a look at how defendants were perceived differently between contexts. So we put participants into one of 3 context conditions. So they either saw a face in custody, in home, or in a neutral environment. And we presented them with this face and asked them questions regarding their impressions of this person. And these impressions were of trustworthiness, character, and socioeconomic status. These were measured through 6-point Likert scales. And here are our results. So just to orient you to the graph, on the y-axis, high ratings mean more favourable ratings. And you can see that the red bars, which is the custody condition, have lower and therefore less favourable perceptions of character and socioeconomic status than the green or blue bars, which are home and neutral conditions. But we did not see this for the trustworthiness scale. So study 2 was majorly a conceptual replication of study 1, but this time right at the end, we asked participants to provide, with only limited information, how likely it is that this person is guilty of a crime. So we asked this question across different scales. So on a 0 to 100 guilt scale rating, you can see that there's not much of a difference between the coloured bars and context on the guilt ratings. And on our measurement of categorical data, where the blue bars show how many people selected guilty opposed to not guilty, which is shown in the grey and brown bars, we can see the expected pattern. So custody had high guilt ratings, but this did not reach significance. So for exploratory purposes, we looked at whether people had encoded the context as intended. From a methodological standpoint, if people were misperceiving the stimuli, then we probably won't be seeing the pattern of results expected. So we asked people to provide guesses for which environment the person was appearing in. And we had a range of answers, but coded them to be accurate or inaccurate. As seen on the slide, for an example, someone in a custody condition who guessed police station was considered accurate, but if they guessed home or hospital, that was considered inaccurate. And we found a significant interaction between accuracy and context condition. So the graph shows that when people are accurate, there are significant differences in those who saw the custody compared to the home context. But when people inaccurately guess the context, this effect essentially disappears. So this provides us with some interesting results to think about moving forward with our experiments. So what we found was largely consistent with our hypotheses. While we did not see differences on trustworthiness, we did see that custody backgrounds led to more negative characteristics and lower perceived socioeconomic status. And our exploratory analyses also provided evidence that custody might lead to guilt ratings as well. So this provides evidence for a proof of concept that contextual background cues impacts judgments and decisions. But as said earlier, this is just the start of an ongoing program of research that will look at more moderating variables and some more theoretically driven hypotheses. So research on virtual courts more broadly is important. When COVID hit last year, policy regarding how virtual courtrooms ran was developed rapidly, despite having little to no empirical data. So the results here today suggest that there are vast and diverse cues within this virtual space that need to be considered, as they can impact how judgments and decisions are made. Today, I only focused on one aspect, but it is also important to consider additive variables, which makes for exciting directions in future work. We've all seen Zoom gone wrong, such as the infamous cat video that circulated social media just a few months ago. So it's important for research to consider all novel aspects of a virtual court. And although we probably couldn't predict that lawyers would show up as kittens during trials, maybe starting with factors such as backgrounds that we can easily predict and change is a start. That concludes my presentation. Thank you again to Eryn, Meredith and David for all their help. And thank you for listening. I now welcome any feedback or questions that you have. And please feel free to contact me after today as well. I've got my email there and Twitter page in case you're interested in keeping up with my research. Thanks again.
Fantastic. Thank you, Beth. So now we're going to open it up to the floor to see if anyone has any questions. So there actually is a question that's come through the Q&A chat. Beth, would you just like to read it out, or I can read it out for you? Or
yeah, so this is the audio question.
Oh.
In the question and answer box.
Yes.
So the question says, fascinating and important. I'd be interested to know your thoughts on whether this effect would extend to different levels of audio-visual quality, such as does poor quality lead to less trustworthiness? That's a really interesting question. In fact, one of the honours students in Eryn Newman's lab last year looked at audio quality, which I was also a part of for this paper that we're submitting at the moment. And she did find that poor audio quality did impact judgments. Eryn, you might want to comment on something a bit more specific, but I'm pretty sure it did lead to more guilt ratings. It led people to evaluate evidence a bit differently.
Yeah, that's right. So people found the person, as predicted in that question, to be less perceived to be less trustworthy, less likable, and the evidence was weighted as less important in their assessments of the trial evidence.
Yeah.
Back to you, Beth.
Thanks. Yeah, any other questions?
Do we have any more questions from audience members for Beth? You were about to say something, Eryn?
Yeah, I was going to say, we have, the audience is a little quiet today, so maybe it's the case that people are saving their questions till the end, so we can field some more questions at the end if there aren't any now. Yeah. So Amy has her hand up there though.
Hi, thanks, Eryn. Bethany, that was a fantastic talk and super, super clear. One of the things I found absolutely fascinating about it is what's happening in the neutral condition relative to the kind of jail context or on hold kind of context. What do you think that's about?
Yeah, that's very interesting. So you're commenting on the fact that maybe neutral was better or worse than the home context, or just in relation to the custody context?
Well, I might be misremembering, but in the data where you split from accurate and inaccurate, it looked like the home context was reducing the guilt rather than the custody increasing it relative to the neutral in there.
Yeah, so with the accuracy results, I have a feeling we didn't see anything interesting with the neutral condition, because when you looked at how many people were accurate versus inaccurate, the sample sizes were very different. So there was probably only about n equals 5 in the inaccurate for neutral compared to the accurate for neutral, whereas the home and the custody context were more equal sample sizes. So it might have been that reason. Does that answer your question?
It starts to, I think, and I'm actually not sure that you have the answers there in your data at all. Just something really interesting to think about, and I'm really looking forward to seeing further data as you start to unpack this over the next couple of years.
Yeah, thank you. And I think neutral environments and backgrounds are really interesting to look at, because like what I've been looking at, it's just a blank white wall. So it's interesting to see what people might think of for their own environmental context. So even though they have a blank white wall, some people might actually think that they're in custody, and it's like really open to interpretation depending on the viewer and the context. So yeah, I'm really interested in the neutral backgrounds, and we'll definitely look at that a bit more in the future.
So thank you very much.
Thanks, Amy. I think there's also a question here saying, do you second guess your background now every time you participate in a Zoom meeting? Yes, I do, Zoe. I actually changed around my background before I joined today. I guess we have more research to do to look at whether it impacts normal judgments for normal people, academics like myself and that sort of thing, which will be interesting to look at. Yeah, but our data at the moment just shows it's influential for custody environments. So I'm not going to be appearing in custody anytime soon. So hopefully no one negatively makes impressions of me at the moment.
Amazing. Okay, well, thank you so much, Beth, for presenting today. So now we're going to move on to our third and final speaker, Nicholas Wyche. So Nick is a first-year PhD candidate. He's under the supervision of Associate Professor Stephanie Goodhew. He completed a Bachelor of Science honours in 2020, and his current work examines the impacts of ageing upon cognitive processing, with a particular focus on translating theoretical insights into applied contexts. Thanks so much, Nick.
Hello, everybody. Okay, so I'll just start off by sharing my screen. And just a second. Okay, here we go. And just a preliminary note, I have been a bit unwell lately, so apologies if my voice sounds a bit gross at the moment. Okay, so I want to open this presentation by talking about this idea of the relationship between aging and driving safety. Now, one of the many joys of working with an older sample on this research is that they love to talk, and I love to talk to them. And what you find when you get into this topic is that everyone has a story to tell about driving cessation in their life. And that could be, you know, they had a relative or a friend who had their license taken away unwillingly, or maybe they had to help a family member make the difficult decision to hand in their license. But either way, all of these stories pretty consistently illustrate two themes. One of those is that the ability to drive and get around independently is a really significant quality of life. So it determines your mobility, your ability to do things like shop and participate in community events. And those things are linked to self-efficacy and mental health at a more general level. But on the flip side, you also have to think about the public safety prerogatives of driving. So basically, from a road safety sense, older drivers must be able to demonstrate their competencies. Pretty concerningly, in the context of an aging population, drivers over the age of 65 are the only demographic who has an increasing road toll in Australia, and that's going up by, on average, over 2% per year, which is a really stark anomaly in a world where we have that Vision Zero government philosophy of decreasing road toll. So in this context, we have to think about how to resolve this conflict of priorities between individual freedom and the safety of the public. And one way forward is an assessment and training regime. Now, one option for this is what we call the useful field of view task. It's pretty much universally referred to as UFOV as shorthand. Now, this task originated as a tool for predicting the impact of cognitive decline on driving performance in older drivers. Now, it's been around for a fair while, and at its inception, it was linked to spatial attention. So some of you may be familiar with this spatial attention metaphor of the spotlight, where you sort of have this attended region in your visual field that is demarcated. And that spotlight can be large, in which case you lose some attention resolution, or it can be small, in which case you're going to have better processing power. And this diagram that I've taken from a paper doesn't reference that concept directly, but it shows that it has currency in this field. However, generally these days, UFOV is currently described as a measure of cognitive processing speed, which is something that we'll dig into a little deeper at a later time in the presentation. So what is UFOV? Now, it's really entertaining to see UFOV being done because it is almost cartoonishly simple. It basically consists of 3 parts. Firstly, you have your processing speed part, which is task 1 in this diagram. Basically, a little car or a truck will flash up on the screen and you just have to identify that. Secondly, you have what they call the divided attention paradigm. You still have to identify whether a car or a truck appeared at the center of the screen, but then you also have to identify where a stimulus has appeared in a sort of concentric ring outside of that area. And finally, you have what we call the selective attention paradigm, which is basically the divided attention paradigm with a bunch of distractors added in. Now, there are a few different versions of UFOV, but these fundamental principles hold across all of them. And the way that UFOV is scored is it's almost like a measure of your ability to perceive something at a threshold display time. So your ultimate score ends up being the display duration in milliseconds, where you can perform accurately on your given subtask in 75% of trials. Now, UFOV has fantastic predictive validity. We know that it really strongly relates to people's ability to drive safely in the real world. So poor performance on UFOV predicts crash risk, but it also predicts a bunch of other things like fall risk and decline in cognitive health. Beg your pardon. But the main issue that we have with applying UFOV further outside of these contexts is that a theoretical account of the cognitive processes that you actually involve when you perform this task is really far from complete. So we kind of don't know what's going on under the surface with this task, in other words. Now, this is a real pity because it has such great predictive validity, and yet we hit this stumbling block where we can't explain that predictive validity, but we also can't make extrapolations from task performance. So for example, we can't figure out which cognitive processes could be targeted with further training when we do see a poor UFOV score. Now, this ties back to this idea of UFOV as a processing measure, like I mentioned before. So it's well understood and accepted that there's this generalized slowing of information processing that comes with age, and that's an important form of cognitive decline that is in fact healthy and not at all atypical. However, processing speed is ultimately this outcome variable, right? It reflects your ability to complete cognitive tasks efficiently, but ultimately when you use that as a correlate in a design like this, it's not reflecting a process of interest, but rather performance on an unknown group of processes. So when we describe UFOV as a processing speed measure, unfortunately that's mostly illusory, and it leaves unanswered this question of which cognitive functions are actually affected by processing speed declines in UFOV. So there has been a bunch of work that has attempted to resolve this, and it's become a very vexed question in this literature. But unfortunately, it's often not grounded in a solid, like, cognitive psychological approach. So sometimes you'll see really inappropriate scoping of investigations, which are not informed by UFOV's task design. Often you'll get people who just administer a battery of neuropsychological tests and don't really find correlates, or you'll get people who investigate one potential correlate in isolation, neither of which are really giving a clear targeted picture of what's behind the scenes. On the other hand, you also have task designs that are good in principle, but stumble on the hurdle of operationalization. So you often see people using really superficial operationalizations that don't tie back to actual cognitive mechanisms. Like you see people talking about change detection, which can be decomposed into a whole bunch of component processes. Or you can even see people using the same task to operationalize different cognitive constructs, which is obviously really concerning when you're trying to converge on a clear and consistent model. So we wanted to respond to these issues and try and drill down into exactly which cognitive processes are implicated in completion of this task. We had two key aims going into our study design. One of those was selecting relevant correlate factors for consideration. The other one was selecting good, solid operationalizations. So we ended up with this study design where we administered UFOV, as well as 5 other cognitive tasks to a bunch of participants. I won't go into detail about these tasks, but I have listed them there. So last year we tested a sample of younger adults, and there were 20 each. 120 beg your pardon. We're currently underway with testing a sample of older adults also, and we have the full data for the younger adult cohort available to us. We had a good range of most variables there, and especially driving experience also. What we found was that we saw the experimental effects that we expected to see on all of the cognitive correlate tasks that we administered, except for one, which gave us a really strange pattern of results, and we discarded forward. And we also discarded one of those correlate tasks because it demonstrated really quite atrocious reliability. But what came to pass when we went to sort of do our regression analysis and try and figure out which combination of scores predicted UFOV performance was we were absolutely stymied by this ceiling effect you see here. Now, what this diagram is telling you is that nearly every single participant who came along to our study scored at the lowest possible display time for the hardest subtask of UFOV. And it was even more dire for the previous 2 subtasks. So when you have this situation where everyone has essentially maxed out the scale that you're looking to use, it's really hard to make inferences about variance, because if you try and use the leftover portion, you don't really have power to do anything. But also when you have the exact same score cropping up time and time again, you're not really going to get meaningful statistical insights. So yes, as you can see here, subtask 1 and 2, really almost nobody was not performing at ceiling level, and that skew was just not possible to correct for us within the scope of our design. So what we take away from this was that this task was simply too easy for the younger adults that we were trying to administer it to. And when you try and do a regression analysis or even a correlational analysis, that's totally inappropriate because you have this incredible heteroscedasticity here. That flat line along the bottom is the sample who scored at ceiling level, and that sort of more sloped subgroup is the people who did not. So what I want you to take away from this presentation today is that whatever is driving the predictive value for UFOV for younger and older adults doesn't seem to be the same thing. And that ties back to our understanding of driving performance in a cognitive sense more generally. Failures in driving performance in younger adults tend to be associated with decrements in experience. On the other hand, with older adults, as UFOV ultimately ties back to, it's more about decrements in capacity, where your perceptual and cognitive processing systems are in decline in the first place. So what we're doing in response to this finding is that we're currently underway testing a sample of older adults, and we've made some modifications based on our experience, removed those 2 tasks that I flagged as problematic. And with our current status, we're about halfway through data collection, we are starting to see some of our correlates emerge as strong predictors of UFOV performance, especially visual search and the ability to sort of change your attended region in a short period of time. So, I seem to have cut off my final slide. Basically, what I want you to take away from this is this idea that older adults, we often think of them as, really struggling with cognitive tasks. And we do see that quantitative decline in performance where they are slower to complete things, but ultimately a lot of those qualitative processes remain intact. So people do things in the same way, they're just doing it slower. And I might wind that one up there just because I'm struggling to keep speaking. Just have a drink of water. And yes, I had a references page and things, but it doesn't seem to be attached at the moment. Apologies. Okay, and that's that. So I'm happy to take questions now if people have any.
I'd just like to say thanks so much, Nick, for presenting, and thanks for being the first year to present in the seminar this year. We really appreciate it. Yeah, and that was great.
It was a pleasure.
That was very insightful presentation, and you're doing some really great research.
Thank you.
So is there anyone that would, oh, I see that Amy's raised her hand. Yep.
Hi, thanks, Nick. That was a fantastic talk. I wanted to circle back to your extensive conversations that you're having with participants around all of this testing. And, you know, one of the challenges we've really seen in this space is getting tasks like this moved into actual testing for licenses because they don't have such an obvious face validity. You know, we've been testing eyesight for a long time. There's been arguments about driving simulators because of that face validity. I'm just wondering, have you got any ideas about how we can make this more appealing at a kind of face validity kind of way that engages those in charge of this kind of testing into that space?
Yeah, that's a wonderful point, and it's definitely something that's central to this program of research that I hope to undertake. Just to add a bit of context for people who may not know, currently the system in the ACT for relicensing older drivers is that if you reach the age of 75 and you want to retain your driver's license, you generally undergo a yearly medical test to check that you're not going to have any kind of medical episode behind the wheel, and you also maybe have an eye exam attached. Possibly you'd have some further testing if there was concerns about your cognitive health. But what that doesn't account for is the more dynamic processes that UFOF does. And this stumbling block that Amy has correctly identified is how to implement this in the real world. And I was actually having a conversation with some GPs about this recently, and they effectively said, please don't make us do this testing. It's already horrendous enough to sort of decline someone's license renewal because it's such a personal and horrific experience to take away someone's independence in that sense. So there's definitely a degree of institutional pushback against the idea that doctors have to do more and do more of that sort of, you know, hard-ass role, I would call it. In response to your question, I think that it's really important to be sensitive to why we're administering this test. So obviously we want to know if people are experiencing declines in their cognitive processing, because that is a major and currently overlooked aspect of their ability to drive safely. But equally, it's important to know that there are training regimes out there as well. So there are adaptations of UFOF itself that you can get people to do a few training sessions on. And what we find is that that training generalizes into real world scenarios quite impressively, and that people do actually recover driving performance that they've lost and their reaction times improve. So I think that a really important way of pitching this is that it's not the end of the road taking away someone's license, but rather giving them an opportunity to train and reskill. I admit that I'm stymied about how to deliver that and what form that would take. But I think, yes, presenting this not as the end of the road is a crucial component of this research.
Thanks, Nick.
All right, I see a question has popped up. Yes, so the question that's popped up here is there enough non-maxed out people to create a binary variable that's usable? Yes, so this was something that I looked into when I was writing my honours thesis actually, and we went back and did the binary logistic regression of like, did you reach ceiling level or did you not? And unfortunately, there just was not enough non-maxed out people, as you call them. I think it was about 24 of a sample of 104. And even when we did that, like, you know, basically we could only put one variable into that binary regression and try and you know, maintain any kind of statistical form, and it just didn't come out as significant. So I would say that we just didn't really have the ability to detect that, even if we were seeing it.
I believe at this point we would think about handing over to Narisha. Is that correct, Narisha?
Yes, so thank you again, Nick, for that great presentation, and a big thank you to all of our speakers today. Thank you also to everyone who attended for attending our first graduate research seminar this year. There is just a note that if anyone does want to participate in the future in the graduate seminar, we do have opportunities for second semester, and we would really encourage you to just send either myself or Neve a message if you are wanting to do that. And that opportunity is open to first years as well. So if anyone does want to participate, just let us know. But apart from that, thank you for coming, and we'll see you at next week's seminar, I guess.